so far, all this data that we have been requesting is just like some JSON file that I uploaded to the internet. And so these files are like static. They won't change unless we like re-upload something. And that's fine. That might be helpful for us in certain cases. More often than not, though, when we're fetching data from the internet, we're going to fetch it from some kind of dynamic source called an API. We'll talk about APIs a lot more next class, but in the remaining 20 minutes, I'd like to start a challenge together and see if we could finish it. So I think I'll probably ask for the answers, the solutions at the beginning of next class. So you could always take this as homework, but for the remaining 20 minutes, I'd like for us now to move forward into the API challenge, this drinks challenge. It's going to have us continue to practice our ability to fetch JSON data from the internet. But instead of just requesting this data from some file that I uploaded, we're actually going to request some dynamic data from some kind of web service called an API. So let's get into it. All right. So I would encourage everyone to make a copy of this API challenge notebook so you can work in your own copy, and I'll do the same. File, save a copy in Drive. I'll call this our in-class version and share it with you. So here's our in-class drinks API challenge. This should be a fun one, I hope. Before we dive into the details of this challenge, we'll see that it's a pretty quick challenge. There's just one set of instructions. We also see, I guess, some of our familiar image display code. And so we might be doing some image display, and we could take a look at the examples. We should know how to do this by now, but there's some setup code for us. Okay, great. There's some image display. Okay, we're familiar with that image display by now. So there's some data somewhere about non-alcoholic drinks. We'll have to figure out how to fetch it, and we'll take a look at that in a sec. After we have this data, we are then challenged to answer these questions, like counting the number of drinks, looping through each drink and printing its name, and finally displaying an image of each drink. So it's a very simple challenge. After we get this data, we'll just loop through it and like display information about each one. Okay, so where's this data coming from? Let's focus on the instructions and let's check out this link to the Cocktail DB API. We'll deal more with APIs next class. An API is just a programmatic source of information. Okay, and this one's called the Cocktail DB. There's some data about cocktails here. And since there's many underage students, we'll be working with non-alcoholic drinks in our exercise. All right, so whenever we're working with an API, a source of data, it might provide us a number of different kinds of data. And so we'll have to read through the API documentation to learn how to work with this API. What kind of data does it provide? What URL do we need to request to get the data in question? Then we could request that URL in the browser, see what the data looks like, confirm there is some data there, and then we can move into our Python programming. So my challenge for you with the remaining 15 minutes, and if you don't finish, no worries, we're gonna share the solutions at the beginning of next class. So your challenge is to read through this API documentation. Just read through it a little bit. you'll see that there's a number of URLs that it provides data through, but different URLs might give us different data. Like one URL might help us search a cocktail by name, look up a random cocktail. So different URLs will do different things. So you'll need to find the one that will give us a list of non-alcoholic drinks. So that's part of the challenge. And then you'll just need to fetch that data and answer the challenges. With the remaining time left in class, I would like for you to work on this. And if you have questions, let me know. Okay. So in terms of a recap, let's take a look at this API challenge related to the drinks, and let's do this together. And I'll be asking for some solutions. So if you haven't yet copied this drinks API challenge notebook for yourself, I would encourage you to do that now. Otherwise, I'll be asking for some solutions. So I guess there's some example image display. We know how to do that. And then there's just some questions like about this data that we will get from this drinks API. How many non-alcoholic drinks? We'll loop through them and print the name of each and display the image of each. So this Python, to answer the challenges, is going to be pretty easy. We'll have a list of items. We'll pass it into the len function. We'll loop through that list. We'll use our image display. That's super easy. But how do we get this data? That's the new stuff that we're focusing on this week. So let's focus on that a little bit together. I guess here we're prompted to use the Cocktail DB API. So I guess it has some source of data for us about maybe some non-alcoholic drinks somewhere. Yikes, what a web page. So we are forwarded or the exercise tells us about this API documentation page, but like, where do we go from here? Somewhere this site is going to maybe give us some information about non-alcoholic drinks. But first, it's very important and necessary for us to read the documentation for some API that we're working with. And the question that we're asking is like, well, what is the URL that we need to request to get that data back? So did anybody find the URL that we're looking for here? If you scroll down on the page, there's filter by alcoholic. Yeah, so I guess this service allows us to make different kinds of requests, and different APIs will give us a handful of capabilities, a handful of different data sets, and it's up to us to request the right data that we want. So that's why reading the docs is so important first. I guess we could search cocktails by name or by ingredient maybe, and that could be cool. Or just get a random cocktail, but we want a list of non-alcoholic drinks. So like eventually we scroll down. There's a lot of different URLs that could give us different data. And here, like, we have a clue here. We find this URL that either, I guess, we could use this first one to ask for alcoholic data or, alcoholic drink data, or the second one to fetch non-alcoholic drink data. Before we actually go requesting data from one of these URLs, what's the difference that we see visually between both of these URLs? Like, a lot of it's the same, like between these two different URLs here. A lot of it's the same, but some of it's different. Yeah. JSON. Say that again. One of them is API. Yeah, well, I think we see like, oh, wait, I see that. Yeah. There's some common part of the URL. That's like what we would call like the base. And it will be common for a lot of these different URLs. Did I see another hand? Yeah. Yeah. The different parts are just in this last bit after the question mark. Sometimes we'll have like a totally different URL without any question marks. And so we'll just be like, okay, we'll use this URL or that URL, depending on what we want. Sometimes those URLs have these question marks in them. This question mark is a specific thing, and it says there are some URL parameters to follow. Like in this URL, we had some base part of it to start. Question mark, now there will be some essentially like key value pairs here. This URL only has one URL parameter, and I guess it's called A, and whatever, that's just the way this site designed their own API. And so question mark, what kind of, I guess, alcoholic status A? And now we provide this equal sign. So this is like a key value pair. So like when we are actually using a function in Python, we might say like parameter X equals whatever, parameter Y equals whatever. And so this is kind of similar. We're just customizing the URL that we are asking data from. And we'll see URL parameters in more detail when we work with our next API, the financial data API. And we'll see a lot of different URL parameters. But anyway, just want to talk to you about some aspects that we see here in this URL. But anyway, finally, yes, we found this URL. Great. So what do we do now? What's our process? The recommended process that I shared with you last class, before we go writing Python code to go fetch this data, what might be a first step that we could take or a next step that we should take? Before we even get to the coding.
I'll make sure that we check on the URL.
Yeah, like, okay, let's just confirm. Did we get this URL right? Can we visit it in the browser, make a GET request in the browser? So here I'm just going to copy this and then paste it into the browser. Whoa, look at all this data. Whoa. And so, okay, we might not be sure exactly what structure this data is in. We can hopefully see that it's JSON formatted. We see like some list or dictionary like stuff. We don't see CSV data here. That's the point. So I guess we're going to be working with JSON data. And that's important for us to know because the method that we use to process this data will depend on what kind of format it's in. If it's JSON data, we'll use the request package in the JSON module. If it's CSV data, we'll just use the pandas package very easily. Okay, anyway, we made a request in the browser. It is giving us some data. Okay, so we're confident that this is the right URL. One weird note about this Drinks API specifically is that when they list these URLs in the docs, they omit the HTTP, which is a required part of the beginning. So when we paste this into the browser and then like copy this full URL, we'll note that it has the HTTP prefix, and that is the full URL that we'll be using. So we found the URL, great. And we can request it in the browser, but we know we want to make this request programmatically. So now we can go to use the request package like we heard about. So now let's start to do this in Python. Let's get the data and then we'll try to inspect it. Well, what structure is this data in? I'll show you a tool that we could use that's immensely helpful. And then we'll answer these questions at the bottom about the data. So we read the docs, great. We found the URL, awesome. We made an example request in the browser. We know that that URL is right. So now we're ready to make that request in Python. So somewhere in the questions section, I'm just going to do this. And we heard that we're going to need to use the request package, but does anyone, I'd like to call on a volunteer to lead us through the code part of this. How can we request this data? I guess first we're going to need to know what the URL is. Maybe we'll call it like request URL, and it's just like a string. We could store it in a variable. All right. So yeah, I'd love a volunteer. How can we request this data in Python? Yep, we know because this is JSON data, we'll need the request package, and we'll need the JSON module. Okay. Perfect. All right, we have this response object. You can call this variable R or response. Okay,
I did like the JSON load string, so like another variable called.
yeah, like data, maybe, sure, yeah. So I'm just gonna start using this variable called response. You can use whatever variables you want here. R is fine. For me, if I name this variable response, oh, it helps me remember, oh, it's a response data type from the request package. All right. What's this JSON step about? We have the response data here in this response text. So why do we need to do this step? Yeah. We remember from last class that this response object, its text property has the data we want, but it's still in dumb string format. Print, what data type is this response text? It's still in dumb string format until we finally convert it using the JSON modules loads function. Now we have our data, and now we can ask, well, what data type is our data? And then maybe we can go from there. All right, we have a dictionary. Cool, I'll share this in Slack. Thanks. This is half the battle, getting the data. Luckily, this process is really similar. I guess you could use the same exact code every time, but just change the URL, depending on what URL you want to get data from, because the rest is just gonna be the same. So hopefully, if you just make a note about this process, it won't be that bad. You could just copy this code block and then change the URL and get some other data. All right, questions before we move on? All right, cool. So, hey, we have our data. What the heck does it look like? I guess it's a dictionary. If we just mention that variable as the last thing in a cell, we see this like nice visual representation that might help us make sense of its structure. What are the keys? How many levels is it nested? But I'd like to show you an alternative module that will help us see a nested data structure in a little visually pleasing way. So sure, we could just mention this variable as the last thing in a cell, and Colab will format it nicely for us. If you're working locally in like a local script, you might find it helpful to pretty print this, which will achieve the same result. So the pprint module, we could say from the pprint module, import the pprint function, and pprint function is like a pretty print version of the print function. So we use it the same as the print function, but it will like print nested structures in a pretty way. So if we print the data, it'll just be on one line and maybe not super apparent like what the structure of this data is about. We'd have to dig into it. What data type is it? What are the keys? Go down one level at a time. But if we pretty print the data, we'll see something similar to what happens when we just mention that variable last in a Colab cell. We see this like visually helpful printed format. So I just wanted to share with you the pprint module. It might help us just kind of make sense of this structure a little bit. How to make sense of this super nested structure. Maybe we could pretty print it. But there's another tool that I would encourage you to use as well. And I mentioned this at last class. So let's take a look at this pretty formatter tool. There's a number of versions of this online. But like we have some JSON. We saw it in the browser And it's super intimidating. What is going on here? How do we even make sense of this? I guess maybe there's a top level drinks key. We can see that, but then like what's going on after that? There's some kind of list, but then I don't know, my brain can't parse this. So what we can do is like just copy this JSON data into a tool like the one I just shared, like a JSON pretty print tool online. Sure, we could use like the pprint function in Python, but if we just paste this data into this tool, let's see, how do we do this? We want to pretty print it. Oh, here we go. Make pretty. So we paste the data in on the left and maybe just like make it pretty. Okay, so this will just format this data for us in a way that's easier for us to digest from a visual sense. Now, when we take a look at this, I think this is a lot easier to look at and understand what is the structure of this data. So we might find it helpful to use tools like this. By using this tool or just like pretty printing the structure in the Colab notebook, what do we observe about the structure of this JSON data? After we get it in Python, like what data types are we looking at? What could we expect? Yeah, I just want to spread out the volunteering here. Thoughts? Like what kind of data structure would we be expecting when we work with this in Python? Just observations about what this data structure looks like. Yeah, like maybe we have like a list of dictionaries and like each drink is its own dictionary. Cool. What else can we learn about visually from inspecting this? No wrong answers here. Yeah. Yeah. So look, like at the top level, we have the squiggly. So at the top level, this is like dictionary or object like. Looks like this dictionary has a key of drinks, which has a list like value. But what happens if we collapse this drinks key? I guess that's it. So our data is like in this dictionary, in this drinks key, and there's the list of dictionaries that we care about. Okay, cool. That process of just kind of reasoning about the structure of the data and what we might expect is super helpful because now it gives us some kind of plan when we process this in Python. Otherwise, we can just ask, what data type is this? Oh, it's a dictionary. What are the keys? And then just go down one level at a time and we'll learn the same thing. But sometimes visually, this could be a lot quicker. So now we'll explore the data. And maybe we have our data print. What data type is our data? It's a dictionary. Okay, so data.keys. What are the keys of this dictionary? There's only one. It's called drinks. Okay, let's grab it. Maybe we will store it in a variable called drinks, just for ease of reference. And that would be data, the drinks key. Now, what data type is this? It's a list. Okay, here's our drinks list now that we could work with. And now we're ready to answer these questions. So now I'd like another volunteer to kind of take us through answering some of these questions. We have our list of dictionaries. Now we should just be in super comfortable mode. Our goal now is to print the number of these drinks, or they're all non-alcoholic, and then loop through them and print the name of each. We might have to inspect each dictionary to learn the structure and its keys. And then we'll do these first, and then we'll also maybe add an image. So volunteer to help us with this. Let's start by printing the number of these drinks. This should be kind of not too bad, hopefully. Yeah, this is a list, so we can count the number of items in it. Perfect. That's it. 58 sounds good. Cool. Let's move it on. Our next challenge is to loop through these drinks and like print each one, print the name of each. How could we get started on this? Yeah.
Create a folder, so it's for the name that is different. Things for reference, string thing, so then it's something very.
Yeah. If we want to just start by looping through them and printing the whole thing, that might not be a bad start. Oops, print D. Okay, each drink looks like a dictionary. What keys does it have? Visually, we could see like str drink, whatever that means. This is a terrible key name. Str drink thumb, I guess, is like the image URL. And then like ID drink is the drink's identifier. So, okay, whatever. We're just dealing with whatever keys they're giving us here. Also, when we were inspecting the structure in our online tool, here we see each dictionary has these keys. str drink, I guess, is the name of the drink. Str drink thumb and ID drink, whatever. Each API that we work with will give us data back in a different format, and it's up to us to just observe what we've got and work with it. So these weird key names, it's okay, we'll just deal with it. And like we heard, maybe we could just print this dictionary's like str drink key. So this is a dictionary, it has a str drink key, so that will help us just print all the names of these drinks. Cool. Let me share these in Slack with you. All right, almost done here. We have looped through and printed the name of each, but we know that another key here is the URL to the image. And so I guess we could do some image display, and that's the last thing we'll do. So I'd love a volunteer to help us add some image display to this loop. And we could reference our setup cells here. I guess there's some examples. Thoughts? Yep. Like copy something from the setup. Yeah, like just this one right here. Sure. All right, so we've got some boilerplate image display code. Where should we put this? Inside the loop. Awesome. Yeah. Perfect. This key that has the image URL in it, I guess is called like str drink thumb. Let's check it out. Str drink thumbnail image, I guess. All right, and that's it. When we're reaching into this dictionary and grabbing its thumbnail key, that gives us the URL. Okay, great. We pass that to the image display example. Boom, here we go. We have our menu of drinks, and that's it. Nice, thanks. Questions, thoughts before we move on? All right, I'll share this with you in Slack. Cool. So I hope that was somewhat fun. And it's like a practical thing that we could do. Like we're training a machine learning model to differentiate between types of drinks. Let's get some data for that model. Okay, we can get it from the API. Or like, hey, we're making an app and we want to suggest a drink based on some like ingredients. Maybe we can use a different URL from that API, pass it an ingredient, get some drinks back, and now display some more information about them. There's other URLs provided by this API, so we could dig into it in a little bit of a different way. But hopefully, now we just have some practice with like working with an API. What is it about? We're fetching JSON data. Okay, great. We're trying to understand what the structure of the data is like. And depending on what that structure is, we'll have to take certain steps to process it.